Hey listeners, I appreciate you joining me today for episode 786 of People Behind the Science. This week, we're broadcasting our interview with Dr. James O'Dwyer. Listeners, if you haven't met James yet, his lab uses computational and theoretical approaches to better understand the patterns that we observe in the world. He's an ecologist and is particularly interested in biological complexity. The goal of his lab is to build models and make predictions that will provide us with novel and unexpected information about how nature works. And in our interview, we learn more about James, his career, and his research. So I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am delighted to be here today with Dr. James O'Dwyer. So, James, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Marie. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. I am delighted to speak with you today, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So I'm going to give them just a little bit of background about you. Listeners, James is an assistant professor in the Department of Plant Biology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He was awarded a master's degree in physics from the University of Durham, as well as a master's and PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Cambridge. He was also awarded an Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council Postdoctoral Fellowship, conducting research at the University of Oregon, as well as the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. Next, James was awarded an Omidyar Postdoctoral Fellowship at the Santa Fe Institute, and he served there before joining the faculty here at the University of Urbana-Champaign. Now, James is here with us today to tell us about his journey through life in science, listeners. So, James, today we want to get to know you both as a scientist, but also as a person. So, can you kick off this interview by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
Absolutely. Thanks, Marie. Outside science, I think life changes a lot and it can change kind of quickly. So I was thinking, if you asked me that question a couple of years ago, I probably would have said, I like hiking, I like to travel, I like some nerdy things like board games. But as of last month, I'm a new father at my first daughter.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you very much. So I was thinking, what is my main interest outside of science right now? It's trying to get sleep here and there and focusing on a lot of diaper changing. And that's probably my main interest. I'll pick up some of the other things as I go on, but that's the main thing that comes to mind right now.
Well, it sounds like we caught you at a very exciting time in your life.
Absolutely, yeah.
So very cool to hear about your family and some of the things that you like to do before you started your family. So what was your favorite board game?
We still kind of play those here with some friends we've made in Urbana-Champaign. There's the classic Settlers of Catan.
It's a solid choice.
That's been a favorite. I think since I was wasting hours in graduate school with playing that. We've played some recent ones. Ticket to Ride is a fun one we played recently, building trains across America. And Seven Wonders, that's another good one that we've tried. So yeah, just any of those kind of strategic, nerdy, anything where you've got cards and pieces of wood to move around a board.
Right. And something to think about, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
I struggle with these strategy games. I know my goal is always to have the longest road award in Settlers of Catan.
Yeah.
But that is my only goal. I have no chance of winning, so the strategy's not there.
Once you start building the longest road, though, it's hard for it not to become an obsession, and it becomes the only thing you focus on.
Right. Well, fantastic to hear about life outside of science, James. But next, I am going to ask you about your scientific side. So can you tell us how you describe what you do at work to someone who might not be familiar?
My semi-official title, I describe myself as an ecologist and interested in biological complexity more broadly. And that's a bit of jargon, really. So in terms of somebody who's not familiar with any of that, I guess the first thing is to say I'm primarily a theorist. So I'm interested in coming up with the theory behind what we observe in the natural world. Occasionally, my collaborators have allowed me near something in the field or more experimental, but I sort of feel they're probably watching in the background to check everything and redo it if I get it wrong.
Right. Cringing, yeah.
Yeah, probably. So I'm really a theorist, which means my lab is a dry lab, not a wet lab. And so I'm behind a computer or with pencil and paper. That's my kind of day-to-day thing, or often these days in meetings and talking to lots of people. But doing things which are computational and theoretical is my bread and butter. So a good question is, what does somebody hope to get out of doing that stuff? I'm interested in biology and I'm not there in the lab manipulating bacteria in test tubes. I'm with a computer or with my notebook. And to try and kind of distill down what the goal of that is, I would say a couple of things. One thing sort of broad and one thing more specific. So the broad thing is, what I look for is kind of the element of surprise in theory. What can writing down a model of a system and making predictions with that model, what can that tell you that you didn't already know, or that wasn't obvious, or that you wouldn't have expected? And I think that's extremely important coming into biology, and I'll tell you a bit more later on about my trajectory, but coming into biology from outside, I wasn't trained as a natural historian. I like to draw on that, and I like to draw on my colleagues' expertise, but that wasn't my background. And so I feel it's kind of a waste of time if your theory is just telling you things that expertise in natural history would have told you anyway. So what I really like is when there's something new that you wouldn't have expected. So it's really the element of surprise is what gets me excited.
I like it. Well, I think this element of surprise, this curiosity is something that motivates a lot of people.
Absolutely. And it's not to say you can only like that if you're a theorist. That's definitely not true. If you're doing any kind of science, that's kind of what you're looking for, I guess. But I don't like to kind of be, I think it's a story by Borges, the idea of making a map of the world which is identical to the world. And then you get to that point and you think, well, what's the point in doing that, right?
Right.
The idea of theory to me is you're trying to develop something that is admittedly simpler than the real world, but reveals something that you didn't know about it, or helps you in combination with experiment and fieldwork to reveal something new about the real world.
Well, I think that is a great description. I like how you break it down to really focus on the goal of it and what your plan is, what motivates you, what excites you about what you do. And on the topic of motivation and being excited about going to work, do you have a favorite motivational or inspirational quote? I'm a quote person myself, and these keep me going on my tough days.
I'm probably not a quote person, honestly. I might see things and like them, and they may not stay with me. Well, I don't have any motivational posters hanging in the office with a quote to read there, but we do have something in our house, which is needlework by Shakers, the religious group. Mm-hmm. The quote on there is, "'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be plain." So I was thinking that's the only quote I could think of, which I do like and resonates with me to some extent. Although I think that the Shakers' eschew reproduction almost died out as a religion, and so therefore it's probably not the best quote for somebody interested in patterns in the living world.
Right. Evolution. Yeah.
Exactly. But it does resonate with me. As much as I'm interested in answering questions about these extremely complex systems, trying to keep things as simple as I can as I'm doing it makes sense to me.
Well, I think that is a great quote to keep in your head as you're working with these complex systems, like you said. And I'm curious next to hear about some of the people who have motivated you or inspired you along your journey. I think as a scientist, you get to work with so many phenomenal people. So can you tell us about some of them?
Yeah, and I'm not going to do justice to all of the phenomenal people who have encouraged or helped me or mentored me along the way. So I'll put that caveat in there first.
Right, the little disclaimer, I like it.
So no one feels left out. But there definitely have been really important people. To kind of the trajectory that probably anyone takes in science, and certainly looking back on my own trajectory, involves a lot of luck in certain places and a lot of support from hopefully from the right people. And so I feel very fortunate that I've had both of those along the way. So just thinking back to really what set me on my current trajectory, I was extremely fortunate to land in Jessica Green's lab. She's a microbial ecologist at the University of Oregon. And that was my first postdoc after finishing my PhD in the UK. And looking back on it, and you don't see this being a student or a postdoc necessarily, but looking back on it, she was taking a chance in bringing somebody in from outside without necessarily the right expertise. But she saw that there could be something worthwhile in inviting me to join her lab. Ever since I joined, and since then, she's provided great mentorship and been just very helpful in terms of both thinking about the scientific questions that I would find exciting and interesting, and then also, I don't know what the right way to describe it is, but I think everyone in science eventually ends up thinking maybe a bit more strategically and what's the right direction to take in order to be able to continue doing that science that you love. And so I think she was great from both perspectives. So she brought me on board, which is a key thing in the first place, and really helped me to develop the science I'm interested in and to be still doing it now. But as I think back through, my PhD advisor, Hugh, was terrific. It took us a while to kind of click, but I think by the end we really did. There have been people who were kind of instrumental in getting me onto that PhD program and on that track. And I remember distinctly a guy, Neil Turok, who's now a big shot at the Perimeter Institute in Canada. As I was finishing that master's degree in Cambridge and trying to move on to the PhD program, and thinking about which field, which area of physics I would like to do, he said, well, you've always got to follow your nose. Mm-hmm. That has stuck with me, that quote, since then, because you don't always have that choice to do exactly what you want to do in science. There's all sorts of other constraints, obviously. Nevertheless, I've always thought since then I should be constantly examining what I'm doing and thinking, well, is this what I'm passionate about? Do I desperately want to know the answers to these questions? If not, why am I doing it? That kind of set me on this trajectory. And then one more person that I was thinking, there was a great professor in my undergrad, Clifford Johnson, who's I think now at Southern California, And as an undergrad, and I was just interested in learning as much as I could at the time about theoretical physics. And so he very kindly let me audit lots of graduate classes, which I probably shouldn't have been in. And I learned a lot from him. And he also helped me with that next step of the trajectory, I think. So I'm not doing justice to everyone who I've interacted with along the way. But I do remember all those little pushes in the right direction. They all kind of contribute over time.
Absolutely. And I think this theme that's coming through is having these mentors, having these people in your life who were able to maybe direct you to the next step. And I think that's often a really difficult decision to make. You're sort of at this crisis moment every time in your career that you come to one of these forks in the road and you have to decide which way to go. So
yeah, those come up all the time in big and small ways. I think those crossroads where you do need often some help and perspective to make those decisions.
Definitely. So James, can you take us back to the beginning now and tell us what are some of your earliest memories of becoming interested in science and maybe specifically in physics?
Let's go back even further now to high school years. It took me a long time to get excited about science, I think. I remember even when I was 15 or 16, 17, I was planning to go to university, hopefully, but I was thinking about majoring in English literature.
Interesting.
So my focus wasn't science. I remember maybe giving some of my physics teachers a hard time when I was in high school. But for some reason, something just clicked at a certain stage. And it was pretty much just as I was going to university, as I was going up there. I think I kind of even switched around the courses I wanted to be on. And in the UK, you tend to pick pretty much at the beginning the major you're going to be in all the way through. So it's not quite as much flexibility. So I remember right at the beginning, I was kind of switching between English and then to math and then landed on physics.
That's a big jump too.
Yeah, I guess it was one of these times of uncertainty, one of those crossroads, I suppose. And I guess what I really like about physics is there's kind of a physics mindset, a way of trying to understand the world. Some of it is being able to solve nice problems. I'm sure that was appealing at the time. You can set up a problem and work your way through to the end and find a solution. But it's not just that. And that's certainly not the part of it that comes through now, because the ecological questions are, in a way, much more...
Right. There's no clean answer, yeah.
There's often no clean answer, yeah, exactly. But I guess that way of thinking about the world where you try and extract what are the essential parts of what's going on here and formulate, maybe it's even that stage of formulating a question. That might be the best way to put it. When I'm teaching now, I teach a theoretical modeling in biology class here. People come in often thinking, oh, the hard stuff here, and they may not have had as many math classes as I had coming through undergrad. The hard part, they think, is learning the math or the coding or whatever else it is. And actually, I would say the hardest part in science, and certainly in doing theory, or good theory, is formulating the right questions. And so maybe that's what kind of appealed to me in physics, was the idea of really trying to, and maybe not always succeeding, but trying to extract the essence of a problem and use that to formulate the question or the model or the equations that you then need to solve. And so I guess it's that kind of translation of a problem into a quantitative form is, I think, probably what resonated with me at the time. That's maybe one of the main things I take from that training even now.
Certainly. So I know you transferred from this field of more pure physics into more of an applied realm in ecology, biology, these sorts of things. Yeah. Can you describe this transition? Was it a challenge for you?
It was definitely a challenge. I went into a PhD and I was primarily working on questions in statistical physics. So really the physics of systems with very large numbers of components. And there is a connection. It's not as clear as I once thought, a connection with ecology and biology, but there's a connection there because often you're dealing with something that could be at least described in those words, but the details, of course, are quite different. So I was doing my PhD in this kind of statistical physics area and in the physics of phase transitions, where you have these qualitative changes in systems with large numbers of components, so for example, from a liquid to a gas. And I really did enjoy that a lot, and there were lots of fun calculations. I remember being very excited when I found some complicated summation of terms which Mathematica didn't know at the time. Probably it knows it now, but I was excited that I could do something that...
Right. You've exceeded its capacity.
Exactly. And so I guess what I'm saying is there were lots of neat little calculations like that I enjoyed doing. That was fun. But here was the real limitation, I guess, or the thing that brought me to that crossroads. I felt that it was just working on a small corner of a picture that was more or less filled in. The broad outline of the picture was pretty well understood in this area. So as much as I enjoyed working on the specific problems I had, when I was looking up at the horizon, I didn't quite know what I was looking for, that bigger question, because a lot of it was understood and maybe I didn't quite see what was the big unanswered question in this area. So I needed something more. I guess that would be a fair way to put it.
Sure.
I should have mentioned somebody who was kind of instrumental at this point with this bridge. There's a guy called John Hart, who's also a former physicist originally, but he's now an emeritus professor in the Energy and Resources group at Berkeley. And somebody said to me, oh, this guy's a former physicist, and they were speaking to me and thinking that I might be interested in environmental or ecological questions. And they said, oh, he's now working on this stuff. And I happened to be visiting friends in California at the time. So I thought, why don't I just go and bug this guy?
Sure, why not?
And see what he says. So that's literally what I did. I may have emailed him first. I don't think I just turned up at his office, but it wasn't far off that. I just said where I was coming from, and I was basically just asking him, are there interesting questions in what you're working on that I could try and get my teeth into? Then after a couple of weeks of bugging him like that, it seemed like there could be. Now, it was a huge learning curve. This was in 2007. And I feel like maybe only now am I kind of really resolving some of those ideas that came up then. Things I thought I could contribute to really took a lot longer than I expected.
Right. It's the story of science, I think.
That's right. And, it's the story of science. Everything takes longer than you think it's going to. Nevertheless, I had that revelation that, okay, well, I've got this training in physics, but maybe, just maybe, it could be useful answering questions in this quite different field. And John encouraged me in that. And then he wrote me a letter of recommendation alongside my PhD advisor and committee members, which, putting it all together, convinced Jess that it was worth bringing me on board into her lab as a postdoc. So that kind of helped me make that transition. But it was really a bit of luck. I happened to find that right person at the right time. But that certainly did help, convince me that the transition wasn't totally crazy and it was worthwhile trying to do. And of course, there was also support from family and friends to tell me it's not totally crazy, but it helped when there was somebody in the field who gave me that encouragement.
Right. I'm a big fan of the regular sanity check. So it's nice to have someone who is in the field, who is in the weeds, who knows the area, tell you that you're not crazy to do this. So
That's right. That's always encouraging.
Well, wonderful to hear about your journey, but I want to know next about where you are today. Can you tell us about one of these projects that you're working on that you are the most excited about?
There's several things going on in my lab at the moment that are exciting. One exciting thing is having great students nowadays. That's something that changes when you start your own lab. Take some of the pressure off having smart people who can do some of the work with you. That's kind of a long-winded way of saying that I've got several projects on the go and some great students who are taking the lead on them. But there's one thing which is ongoing. We had a paper come out recently, but now one of my students, Philippe, is really taking it forward. And it's taking an idea, at least, that would be familiar to people in physics. And the idea is of coarse graining. So looking at a system on coarser or fuzzier scales and changing that resolution and seeing what difference that makes. And in physics, people are very used to that idea, and it comes up actually a lot in what I was doing in phase transitions and statistical mechanics. But the big picture goal or the outcome is that you might be looking at a system on a certain scale and it doesn't look special. It's not obvious what's going on. Mm-hmm. But you paradoxically kind of drop information by fuzzing out the system, by imagine you're looking at it through glasses without the right lenses in. And as you do that coarse graining, patterns can emerge. So things that weren't obvious at a fine grain scale might jump out at you at a coarse grain scale. That's the broad idea. The thing I'm excited about is thinking about, can we do the same thing in ecology? I mentioned earlier the element of surprise is what motivates me in general in doing theory. And if I were to get a bit more specific about what links together the different projects I'm working on, I'm really interested in which of the detailed mechanisms of a system propagate up to large-scale patterns. And so there's an intuition in many fields, certainly in physics, but in ecology too, that you've got so much heterogeneity and so much variation in any ecological system. And yet there are many patterns or phenomena which look more similar across different systems than you might have any right to expect. Mm-hmm. So one of our motivations was, well, maybe looking at the system at this different coarse-grained scale might help those patterns to come out. And so the specific way that we applied that is looking at evolutionary trees. So we're looking at evolutionary trees which are sampled from microbial communities. And so we sample sequence data, infer, try and build up the evolutionary history from that sequence data as well as we can. And there's lots of caveats to doing that, lots of difficulties in doing that. But we do as well as we can in inferring which sequences are the most related and then which are the next most related. And we kind of build this tree backwards till you get to some kind of origin relating everyone. And so the coarse graining we thought about in this system was, what if we reduce the resolution with which we can resolve the order of branching events in these trees? So in other words, if you were to look at it going forward in time, I'm species A and there's a speciation event. Now there are two species and then species C comes in, branching away from the second species. Mm-hmm. Now, the question we're asking is, what if you're not as certain as you think you are about the order of those branching events, or you just want to apply this coarse graining idea? What does the coarse-grained evolutionary history of these communities look like? All right, so that's a lot of build-up. I know that's kind of...
I'm on the edge of my seat here, James. What happens next?
The punchline is kind of cool, though. And the punchline is, when we apply this coarse graining, what becomes very clear in these trees is there are bursts of branching. It's not as though the branching, the evolution in these trees is happening smoothly and gradually. There are these big bursts which suddenly become apparent when you collapse down that resolution at which you're viewing the tree. And this kind of goes back to an old idea in evolution called punctuated equilibrium, which is this argument that Gould and Eldredge made in the 70s, which many people disagree with, and it's been very controversial, that evolution tends to proceed in these jumps. So the nice thing that we thought about applying this physicsy technique to evolutionary trees from ecological communities, the nice thing we got at the end of it was that there are these apparent bursts throughout the trees. And not only are the bursts there, so it looks kind of punctuated, according to this theory, but we can state what they look like in a very quantitative way. So without going into too much detail, one thing that comes out is there's a really characteristic distribution of the sizes of these bursts. So you get little bursts of one lineage kind of bursting into 3 or 4 or 5. And you also get really big bursts, and they're not that rare. So these big bursts are kind of throughout these trees. And so it's still a whole project in progress, but we're really excited to see what that can tell us about the interplay of ecological and evolutionary processes in shaping these communities. And we think that maybe it tells us something interesting.
Well, James, I think you did an excellent job of explaining a really complex and very technical problem that you're working on. So fantastic job.
As always in science, you're really used to working on your own things and certainly talk to lots of people about that series of projects. But there's so much going on in the background there, and I hope I got some of it across.
Absolutely. I think you did an excellent job. And I'm curious, so you mentioned that patterns across a wide variety of organisms and systems seem to be more similar than we would expect. So have you looked at this, and have you seen some of these patterns in a lot of different types of organisms and species and trees?
Yeah, we have. So this is an idea going back a long way in ecology that patterns of biodiversity often really do look surprisingly similar across different systems. So maybe I'll give you a couple of the historical examples, and then I'll say a little bit about what happened in our project.
Sure.
So a very basic question in ecology that people are still asking for many systems is, what determines biodiversity? And in particular, something like the number of species in a system. The answers depend on the system often. But people have started to break that question down into more detailed ways of asking the same question. So, for example, you might ask, well, I am interested in how many species there are in this system, but I'm also interested in how many really dominant, abundant species there are versus maybe some which are very rare, and that distribution of rareness and abundance in a community. Or you might ask, as I look at bigger and bigger ecological communities, I'm expecting I'm probably going to see more species, but how quickly does that increase as I increase the size? Or are there fluctuations over time in patterns of biodiversity? So people have asked all these questions for a long time. And the surprising thing was, I guess, that these patterns, when you look at how the number of species tends to increase with area or the distribution of rare and abundant species, they look very similar across many different systems. So surprisingly so. That might mean that all of the detail somehow is kind of washing out or isn't important for those patterns. But I suspect with many of these patterns, the truth is somewhere in between, that a lot of the heterogeneity and variation in the underlying system maybe isn't important. But I guess something that drives me is understanding precisely which of the properties of an ecological system are important for driving these large-scale patterns. And that's important because you may wish to focus on those drivers if you're trying to make predictions about what happens next as you change something in the system.
Sure.
There is a long history of that, and our project fits into that somewhat. And we looked specifically at a wide range of microbial communities to look at these evolutionary trees, and we saw very similar patterns across all of them. And so we were looking at various host-associated microbial communities, microbiome communities, often people call these. And so you have the human microbiome. There are many different habitats. We looked at a few different kinds of habitat. We also looked at plant host-associated communities. These are bacteria, in this case, living on the above-ground parts of plants. So basically, on their leaves, you put leaves in a bag and shake them and see what comes off. And we also then kind of looked at something quite different, which was not host-associated, but just a variety of marine microbial communities. And we saw something very similar in terms of these bursty branching patterns across all of them. So there's something in common there. And I guess one next step, and it's hard to do this as quantitatively once you move away from microbial communities because the large numbers are really on your side when you're looking at microbial systems. But we're also really interested in whether these patterns apply across the tree of life. And so we're looking at plant communities also. And this is harder because the evolutionary trees tend to be small. The numbers are smaller. And this wasn't what we published, but tentatively, we do see some of the same structure in non-microbial communities. So there is something very intriguing there, and there's a lot of similarities across these different kinds of evolutionary trees. And so, yeah, teasing apart what's exactly the same and what drives the small, maybe, differences between them, that's what gets me excited about the next stage of this project. I know there's something drawing the behavior towards something universal across all these systems, but I also know there are going to be particular drivers, particular quantities we could go out and measure in these systems, which maybe tell us about where this universal behavior might be expected to break down or do something slightly different. So really teasing apart what's the same and what's different, that's the goal for me in these systems.
Definitely. Well, this is fascinating work, James, and I think you've done a wonderful job of explaining it to myself and our listeners. But I know you don't always have fantastic results. You don't always have perfect answers to your problems in science. And I think the career path is often riddled with bumps and ruts and things like that. So I want to talk next about some of the challenges that you face, some of the failures that you've had. So can you tell us about one and how you got through it?
It's kind of tough as a scientist talking about these moments. I think people often don't.
Right.
You often like to have the sanitized story where everything was smooth sailing all the way through.
There's a happy ending, yes.
I do know some people who post all the versions of their papers and grants, even when they were rejected by a journal or rejected by a funding agency. And so that's actually really informative.
Right, yeah.
To see where things break down or where they're able to move on and do better. Anyway, so for sure, one time that was a struggle for me was this crossroads that I mentioned earlier, where I was really shifting from one field to another. And it was just a major uncertainty. And I guess that's often all the way through most of people's careers in science, that kind of uncertainty, not necessarily about your science, although it can be about that too. Sometimes just about what's the next gig going to be and where am I going to be living next? That uncertainty can be a real struggle. I'm not the expert on describing that, but there's a lot of resources and stories out there explaining just how hard that can be. And so I definitely found myself in that position, like wondering, what do I want to do next scientifically and what am I going to be able to do next as I was finishing my PhD? And so you've got to have a bit of perseverance, but you don't always have the full range of choices you would like. So I definitely got lucky to a certain extent there. It did make me think, though. I remember pretty soon after I joined Jess's lab, I kind of started to think, well, I made this major transition scientifically, and I was moving from Cambridge to Eugene, Oregon. So that was the major transition as well.
A couple miles in between, yeah.
A lot of miles in between and different cultures, but both great places for sure. But I did start to think about a way of evaluating how I felt I was doing in science, and that's something I still think about now. And so the way I thought about it was at 3 levels. I don't know if this sounds too kind of nerdy, a way to think about how you're doing in science.
You have quantitated it entirely.
Exactly. I turned it into a math problem. So I thought about 3 different levels of course grading, if you like, as well. That would be another way to put it. So I thought, well, am I enjoying the day-to-day of what I'm doing? For example, I had enjoyed a lot of that in my PhD, doing the kind of problems that are associated with these phase transitions, etc. So I enjoyed the calculations and all that kind of stuff and my colleagues and all that. So I enjoyed the day-to-day. And so I thought, well, I still really want to enjoy the day-to-day stuff. And if I'm not enjoying that, I'm finding myself doing something that I just don't have any passion for, then there's something wrong. But then I also kind of got thinking, physics was the first field I was in. And so I kind of almost didn't question after a while why I was there. Maybe the thought process was just, if they let me keep on doing this, I'll just indulge my interests and keep on going with it. But switching fields got me thinking about, is that really the right way to think about it or not? So I ended up thinking, well, is what I'm doing of any value to this new field? And I had to acknowledge at that point, it might be a while before it was going to be of any value, but that would seem to be an important goal. In other words, the stuff I'm doing, if I didn't do it, would somebody else pretty much do it the same or better tomorrow anyway?
Sure.
I also started thinking about, well, can I explain what I'm doing to somebody who's not associated with science at all, maybe, and for them to at least get a flavor of what I'm doing and kind of understand why it's interesting and worthwhile. And so those 3 different levels, I found that was a good way to evaluate, well, am I on the right track? Sometimes quantifying it like that, for some people, maybe makes it easier, right?
Right. I'm a spreadsheet maker myself, so I do that. Yeah.
And I also figured, okay, having like 100% of all 3 of these things, that's probably impossible. At least it's not going to be true all the time. And so I kind of settled on, in the words of Meatloaf, 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
Right. It's a good threshold, yeah.
I was doing really well on one of these criteria and okay on the other 2. That kind of might be okay overall. So I don't know if that was a reaction to that being at that crossroads, but I found it just a useful thing to come back to as I was going on and evaluating, am I really on the right path? And that did come up then later on. I had a fantastic time at the Santa Fe Institute as a fellow there, and I still have a lot of connections with people there, and I organize working groups there, etc. And it's an amazing place. However, when I first got there, it was a much smaller place than being at a university, and I was totally independent, but that presents a lot of challenges. And so, in a way, just as I had evaluated what I was doing, where I was going when I first got to Oregon, I did the same thing at the Santa Fe Institute for a different set of challenges in a way. It wasn't that I was switching fields, but I was switching to a totally different working environment. And you could say the same thing about moving here to the University of Illinois. It's a whole other set of challenges, being a PI and starting your own lab. So I try and think about those three criteria, and they're not too bad, I think, at evaluating how well you're doing through those tough periods.
Absolutely. Well, I think you have a great approach to getting through these tough times. And I think the ones you pointed to, these periods of uncertainty, when you're sort of at the end of the road for whatever position you're in now, whether it's your graduate days, your postdoc position, thinking about what's next, I think is huge on a lot of scientist minds out there.
It's a real tough thing, and it's sort of an inherent part of the way at least science careers are as of right now.
Right. Every couple of years you're moving around, so it can be a challenge.
Absolutely.
And definitely focusing on these periods of transition. And I really like this evaluation system that you proposed of trying to assess, am I doing a good job? Am I doing something valuable to the field that other people outside the field will also appreciate, or people outside of science? And then, am I happy? I think these are really important things to think about in each new position you find yourself in. So great advice for our listeners out there who might be scientists. But we don't just want to talk about your tough times, James. Next, I want you to share with us today a success story, one of these great moments in your career. And it can be a big win, something like a grant, a paper, things like that, or getting your lab going, or even just a small victory along the way that meant a lot.
Probably have to take less than 50% of the credit for it. My great success is our daughter. That's the most exciting thing at the moment. Well, the funny thing was, I took 2 weeks paternity leave. I'm sure you could have a whole other show on science careers and maternity and paternity leave and all of that kind of thing.
Right. Trying to balance a family. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I took my 2 weeks paternity leave now. And during that time, I had a nice paper come out. Obviously, there was a lot of work going into that beforehand. But I also heard back from two terrific foundations that they were going to be able to support me for the next several years. So that was very exciting news. That was the Simons Foundation and the McDonald Foundation, and they were basically both saying that they really liked the trajectory I was on and that I'd have support to kind of pursue that as I see it over the next several years. So thinking about that in hindsight, I basically need to be on paternity leave more often.
Right. I was going to say that was the best career move ever right there.
So my students were keeping everything going in the lab, and I got these nice emails coming in saying, we're going to support you. And so maybe I'm just thinking on a very recent time frame when you asked your question about successes, but yeah, probably our daughter and then all the success she seemed to bring with her is the kind of the most recent thing that came up. But it's terrific, and it's very fortunate to have these things fall in your lap, really. Absolutely.
Well, congratulations, James, on all these successes. And I think you're underplaying the hard work, I'm sure, that went behind all of these things falling into place within that 2 weeks. But you definitely have to keep your daughter close by from now on. She's your good luck charm. So
that's the message I'm taking from it anyway.
Well, wonderful to hear more about your successes. And in addition to talking about the research, talking about successes, failures, challenges, things like that, I also like to get a look into the everyday lives of scientists. And one way that I like to learn more about the people I'm chatting with is to figure out what is on their bookshelves. So, James, can you give us an idea of what you're reading lately, or a book that you've really enjoyed?
Well, again, this thing changes over time. If you'd asked me a few years ago, maybe during my PhD or postdoc, I would have probably listed off various English novelists, Julian Barnes or Martin Amis, or I used to like the David Lodge's books, his series of books on universities, which makes sense since I was working in a university. Mm-hmm. But I would say now, much more recently, when I've read things, I've actually, maybe much like your podcast, I really enjoy reading about scientists. And in book form, often they're able to tell you a lot more about their work and the person behind the work than you get from papers. So,
sure.
which are obviously a totally different format and much drier and essential for science, but don't really necessarily give you that fuller picture. So something I read recently, which I really enjoyed, is, I think the title is just Complexity, but it's by Melanie Mitchell, who's one of the vice presidents at the Santa Fe Institute now. And it's her career, her life, biography outside and inside of science, and her relationship with understanding complex systems, more or less, I guess would be the right way to put it. But it was really well written and kind of a nice intro to some of the questions, at least, that I've been thinking about. You know, how do we understand complex systems? Now, she's not necessarily interested in ecological systems as such, but there's commonalities between all sorts of different complex biological, social, cultural, economic systems, you name it. That kind of really resonated with me, and it's just really nice to hear what motivated somebody through their trajectory and how they got to where they are now. That's a good one. I would recommend it.
Fantastic recommendation. I'll put that out on our website for our listeners to find. I know I myself am often curious about the story behind the story, right? Which I think you get in some of these biographies, these histories of science. Well, fantastic to hear about what's on your bookshelf, like I said. And I think one of the things that we've touched on throughout our interview are some of the opportunities that you've had as a scientist to travel throughout these different positions you've held over the years. I'm going to make you today pick your favorite place. So, James, can you tell us one of these memories that has really stuck in your mind about a place you've been for science?
as your listeners know, I'm a theorist, so I don't get to go out in the field as much as my colleagues. They don't let me go out too much.
Right.
I don't get to go to the rainforests and various other exotic places, but I guess my main travel for science is for collaboration with colleagues, which is still extremely useful, the face-to-face collaboration and workshops and conferences. And there's one that does stand out, and that was way back when I was just starting out as a PhD student. And it just stands out because, well, it was a fun conference, but it was in just such an unusual place. So it's in a town called Erice, which is in Sicily, and the conference itself and where we were staying took place inside an old monastery.
Oh, wow.
And so it's way up in the mountains. It's just absolutely beautiful. Fantastic group of people as well, and unlimited marsala to drink in the evenings. So it was a great combination. One fun thing I remember there, it was a monastery, and I guess it was the summer, so it was warm. You didn't have windows as such. It was just kind of big, kind of open holes in the room, like going out into a courtyard. And I remember one evening, just kind of heard this noise, like a kind of rhythmic noise, and I realized that a bat had flown in and was just doing circles around the room right above my head.
Oh my goodness. So what'd you do?
I kind of flapped ineffectually at it for a little bit. That didn't seem to work because he was like pretty much in a good rhythm there.
He was not intimidated by you.
No, not at all. And then I think I just said, okay, going to try and go back to sleep. And then eventually he just flew back out again. So it worked out.
You had an evening visitor, I suppose.
Yeah, that's right. So yes, that was just a real interesting place. The location was somewhere quite different from my everyday life for sure at that time.
Well, very cool to hear about one of these unique places that you've been able to visit for science. And I think you're right. I myself am not a field scientist, so my travel with science is typically through these conferences. And they are great opportunities, though, to see different places, to experience different cultures. So besides this bat experience, is there a particular thing that you can pinpoint about the culture, about your experience there that really struck you as very different from what you would encounter on a daily basis?
Sicily itself, the history there is amazing. I remember this was not in Erice itself, but another town that I visited on that trip just to explore a little bit. There was a church there, which was basically part of Greece, effectively, at an earlier point. And so they had these ancient columns formed part of the church, which used to have been a Greek temple at an earlier stage. And then it had kind of, people had just built on top of that. So then various generations of churches at styles of building a church and religions which were built on top of this. And yet you could see everything there. You could see the original columns there and then everything else kind of built on top of it. And so we think in England we've got a lot of history, and coming from the States, people often are amazed how old things are. But then if you go to Italy, you kind of see this, the timescale goes out a stage further, I think. So yeah, that certainly stuck with me. Very striking when you see that kind of history manifest in physical form like that.
Certainly, and being able to see the change over time just right before your eyes. That's so cool.
It was cool, yeah.
Well, in addition to talking about these phenomenal places you've been for science, I want to take a moment to talk about the people you've been able to work with. And I think there are some stereotypes out there about what scientists are, quote unquote, usually like. But we like to break these stereotypes on our program by kind of showcasing the human side of science and talking about some of these phenomenal people you've been able to work with, some of the funny memories you've had with them, and even some of the quirky traditions that spring up in each of these labs that you work in. So can you share one of these stories with us today?
So one thing is, in my own lab, I feel like we have to develop some of these traditions. I mean, that question makes me think, gosh, we need to get a bit more quirky.
It is required.
So maybe it just takes time. But yeah, I should think about what should we do. Maybe we should set up a tradition to celebrate papers or the students in my lab having successes. But so I will think about that. But yeah, I can tell you a story from, well, maybe this will inspire one of our traditions. I don't know. But a story from an earlier lab. When I did join Jessa's lab in Oregon, she was new there too. And so she wanted to introduce herself and her lab to all her new colleagues in ecology and evolutionary biology there. And I think it was a departmental retreat that we went on. And everyone else, the typical thing was, as it always is, to make posters. And she thought, well, why don't we make a video instead? And so we made a video with her and all the new members of the lab. And I was there. It was like my first week there in Oregon, so I thought, it's fun. Why not?
Ready for your cameo, yeah.
So it's on YouTube somewhere, actually. But there's me throwing placards with things written on them, Bob Dylan style, if you know that video. Mm-hmm. Our placards had various biodiversity-related topics written on them instead of political topics, I think. And it was set to a song by Peter, Bjorn and John, which was very popular at that time. So maybe that's what we should do. Maybe my lab has to do a new video every couple of years to introduce everyone in the lab to everyone else in the outside world.
I like it.
Well, yeah, it was a good way for us all to get to know each other.
Listeners, we're going to have to dredge up this video for sure.
Good luck. It's there somewhere. Yeah, I can't remember exactly where it is, but yeah, it's definitely out there.
Very cool. Well, I think this is a great tradition. And I think instilling that sense of tradition in your lab is kind of fun. It's a way to join the generations of the lab over the years, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I'm sure much like people say with their actual families at home, everyone grows up very quickly. I'm sure that happens with your lab family too. So I need to make sure I set that in place before everyone does really well and graduates and leaves me behind.
Before they're too cool for your traditions, right?
That's right. That's right. Before they get to the teenage years, so to speak.
That's right. Well, James, fantastic to hear about one of these fun memories from a previous lab you've worked in. And I think so far we've talked a little bit about your experiences over the course of your career, some of the work you've been able to do, but we haven't yet talked about the questions that are still unanswered in your mind. And I want to know about the big question. If we gave you everything, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, none of these things are a problem, what would you try and tackle?
So first thing to say is I do feel relatively fortunate that I feel like I am able to do the science I want to do. I feel like I'm in a very fortunate position, very lucky to have that. But let's just extrapolate up from there to the total dream situation. What I'd like to understand is really centering around all these topics I've talked about. I'd like to really understand the rules of the game for these complex ecological systems and how those rules change with scale and with the question you're asking. And so there's all these hints out there, like the patterns I'd mentioned that people have been looking at for many years in ecology. But I think we still don't have that framework. And so that's the question for me, is kind of establishing that how can we better understand complex ecological systems in the context of a given set of questions and a given scale at which we're asking those questions. But if I could kind of go even one step further than that dream, and that's just an ongoing set of research questions for me, but I guess I would really like to see those ideas, if we can achieve that goal of understanding the rules by which these systems play, can we use that to build or synthesize or engineer ecological systems? And there's a long history of failure in doing that. People have tried to deal with one problem by, say, introducing an invasive species, and whoops, that caused another problem. So I may be setting myself up for failure there, but maybe that's partly what makes that a great challenge, is that it kind of demonstrates how little we did understand about these systems. And so, yeah, I think that would be fantastic if we can really use the kind of theoretical knowledge to build ecological communities that really do perform the ecosystem services, whether that's human health or something more traditional in terms of ecosystem services, those things we want these systems to provide.
Well, I like it, James. I'm glad you are here today with us to dream big. And I think this is a great question for our listeners and myself to ponder. So
there's plenty of counter-arguments you could give to that goal and the history of things going wrong. So don't worry, I'm not about to go out in the field and disrupt lots of ecosystems out there.
Right.
But I think it's just a challenging and interesting question. When do we get to the point where we understand these systems well enough to do that? And maybe we never will, but that will be the dream.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is a fantastic science dream to have. And now, in addition to talking about these big questions, I love to hear about the advice that you've received along the way. And we've mentioned a couple of your mentors throughout our conversation and some of the great advice that they've given you. But can you pinpoint one piece of advice that you would say was just the best piece you've ever received?
I really like this Neil Turok, this cosmologist, who said to me, follow your nose in science. Now, I don't know if that's sort of actually supposed to be rude, like you're following something really smelly, but it may be. Anyway, the idea of following something that smells good, let's put it like that, really resonates with me. I think if you ask yourself that question, am I just doing something because I'm stuck in a rut here, or am I kind of scenting out the next really cool, exciting thing that I'm going to be passionate about? If you ask yourself that question, usually the answer is kind of clear. That stuck with me. I think that's really good advice. Now, all sorts of constraints counterbalance that. So I'm not saying that everyone's in a position to do that, but it's worth at least asking yourself that question, I think.
Definitely. And I think going with your gut, going with these instincts, following your nose is great advice sometimes when you're at one of these crossroads that we've talked about, trying to figure out which direction to go, whether it's with your research, whether it's with your career, and all these different things in life. So fantastic advice. It's
definitely a very important data point in that decision making.
Right. In your spreadsheet and factored into your score, perhaps.
Exactly.
Well, James, it's been wonderful to chat with you. Can you share with our listeners one parting piece of advice or one inspiring note that you'd like to end our interview on?
Well, I would just say there's no point in my mind in doing science, but maybe it's broader than that. Maybe it's doing whatever you're doing in terms of your career. I feel there's no point in doing it, asking questions if you're not desperately interested in what the answers are. And I feel that it can be easy, certainly in science, and I think probably many other fields, to be asking somebody else's questions or asking questions just because you've seen somebody else do a similar study or whatever it is. So maybe it's the same thing as following your nose or your gut, but I think, asking yourself, do I really care about the question I'm asking here? I think that's a good way to frame it. If you don't really care whether you or somebody else answers them, you're probably asking the wrong questions.
I like this idea of desperate interest. I'm going to have to adopt that in my conversations.
What better way way to be motivated. If you're so excited about these questions that you'll do anything, within limits,
right.
anything reasonable to answer them, then I think that's a good sign.
Definitely. Well, fantastic advice for our listeners out there. Can you tell them now how they can reach out if they want to learn more about you and your work, James?
Sure. Well, and on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @JP_ODWYER. And as time goes on, I'm kind of learning better how to use Twitter. I'm not an expert. But if you go on there, you'll see some of my work, but actually a lot of other people's work that I like to point to. So it's hopefully something of interest to your listeners there. And my email address also, if anyone has any particular questions about the science or just something that came up they're interested in, is jodwyer@illinois.edu. Just spelling that out, actually, I guess I'm not spelling my name out very often, but it reminds me of another story. When I first got to Oregon, one of the fellow postdocs there asked me to spell my name out, and OD she was fine with. And I think when I got to W and Y, she was like, this combination of letters cannot go together.
There are too many consonants, right?
So just reassure everyone that that is the right combination of letters, and they should feel free to contact me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for providing us a way to contact you. Listeners, reach out if you have any questions. And James, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it was a joy to chat with you. And listeners, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.